Welcome, T.S. O'Connell. Welcome, Rich Klein, regular, almost co-host for this. T.S., longtime veteran of Krause and F&W, a hobbyist, artist, editor, worn many hats, as both Rich and I have too. So we're going to enjoy hearing T.S.'s background and hobby journey. Thanks sponsors, Topps Panini and Upper Deck, Heritage Auctions, Harkin Scott Auctions, Mike Stadium Sports Cards, Burbank Sports Cards, ComC.com, and Beckett Media, Beckett Grading, Beckett Authentication. Don't want to rub in the Beckett stuff, TS, but I remember you and your teammates at Krause being worthy participants, not in a battle, but I really feel like between us, we really helped grow the pie. And I want to thank you for your part in that, because we've had a great hobby run that we've all really enjoyed. So welcome to the show, and give us a little more color on your hobby background, how you got to Krause, what you're doing now, and it's great to see you. And welcome, Rich, too.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me on, and thanks for remembering Connell & Son Inc., which was the entity I created almost 40 years ago.
No way.
Yeah,
Though it came in series. So were you releasing them as you were doing the art?
I'll try to make it a 2-minute intro just because there's a fun modern connection to it. In 1981 or 83, let's say, I designed the Baseball Greats series. I had this idea that I wanted to see art linked to baseball cards. So I was working as a public relations director for the Empire State Games in New York at the time. And the O'Connell & Son Inc. was a way to hook up with my dad. So I was going to do the artwork and my dad was going to do the mailing and things. So the cards, the 4x6 cards, 20 Baseball Greats, were done in Indiana. And then in June of that year, Mario Cuomo got elected governor of New York and wanted all of the PR positions to be his people. So a certain youngster named, let's see, what's
Chris?
The Cuomo that just ran into some difficulties there.
Both, but yeah.
Chris, no, not Chris.
Just got let go at CNN.
The governor's.
He's in trouble too.
Yeah, I'm blanking on the governor's name. Anyway, the governor was handling campaign stuff for his father and came into my boss's office and said, "You got to give O'Connell up, and if you give us any trouble, you're next." My boss was a very powerful man in amateur sports, but it took him 5 years to get him, but they got me at that time. So suddenly I was out of work. I had what for me was a huge debt of $2,500 for the printing of the Baseball Greats. And I moved down to Delaware, got married. And for about 3 years, I did just the O'Connell & Son Inc. Sold the Baseball Greats that first year. And then from 84 on, I made a set of mini prints, 36 at a time, standard size cards. And that lasted a few years. And I think in 86, I got a very polite letter from Major League Baseball asking to see my authorization for using logos. And since they knew I had no such thing, I stopped using logos and continued O'Connell & Son Inc. with a few more mini printings, but not using logos. And then in 93, I went to work for Krause and put it all to bed.
Bob Lemke or Krause's radar because of your artistic ability, your editorial ability, your PR, or your set. Was Bob a collector and some of those guys up there collectors to where they knew of you, or were you just...
I freelanced for him. The short answer, most effective answer is I wrote a lot of, I think, good freelance articles starting around the mid-'80s. So when I interviewed, Bob Lemke hired me, God love him, in 1993. And
how much of a culture shift was it moving from New York and Delaware, which is the East Coast, to Iola, the area of Iola, Wisconsin?
I guess there was some of that. One of the ways that I mitigated any concerns about that was I used to love the travel associated with first being an associate editor and then editor of SCD. If I hadn't got out of town 5 or 6 times a year for some nationals and big shows, I suppose I might have been a little stir crazy in a town without a stoplight, but it worked out just fine. Travel was very important to me. And I didn't want it to be so narrow that the editor of SCD out and about and seeing what happens in the big world.
I just wondered if you've always been a nostalgia guy, because I think the hobby in the 80s and 90s was more nostalgia. It's more what's going on right now, because I'm a nostalgia guy. I think Rich is too, to a great degree. Were you always like that?
Yeah, pretty much.
That described?
When I joined the Navy in 1968, I said to my mother, do what you will with anything that I have, but the baseball cards have got to be there. intact when I get out. And so my mother did not throw mine out simply because I asked her not to. And it has always been important.
Note to others out there, perhaps you should, instead of blaming your mother, you should blame yourself for not telling your mother.
That's right.
T.S.
It wasn't that difficult.
Now, my question is, when I would go to a show, I walked around. I never liked really being constrained to a table or a booth when I worked for Dr. Jim. And Jim would have meetings, but he could walk around a bit. I'd always see you at the Krause table.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering how much you actually got to walk around at like a national.
Oh, I always made sure I got to walk around. That was, one of the funnest things. Plus, I needed to get out and talk to the dealers and make sure I understood what was going on. But man, at those Rosemont shows, I'd walk until my knees and ankles and everything else ached. So yeah, I got out, and that was an important part of it.
Those concrete floors are no fun.
Oh,
yeah.
The older you get, the tougher they get.
That's the only benefit of being behind the booth. If there's a little rug or pad back there, it's easier than crunching through the concrete.
So you talked about the challenges of doing the set once you had to do the logos. What was your biggest challenge when you were SCD editor in a market that was beginning almost, I don't want to say decline, but was definitely contracting, especially with print once the internet came roaring?
As both you guys know, the World Series cancellation took a hit on our hobby in 94. Advertising revenues, which had been so phenomenal for SCD during the height of it, started in the other direction, and then probably accelerated after the turn of the century. So coping with trying to keep an editorial product that we could be proud of in the face of pretty generally declining advertising revenues was probably the biggest challenge. Technically not supposed to be a challenge for an editor. That's supposed to be a separate domain, but as we all know, there's intersections there.
The original Krause and maybe even F&W really had a much better blend than we had at Beckett Publications in terms of advertising, classified advertising, dealer advertising, and an editorial. We could never keep up with you on the advertising side.
Yeah, but I wouldn't be too hard on yourself. They were two different beasts.
But I'm saying we were more toward the one side and you were more toward the other side.
Yep.
But you had a little more of a blend, I think. You had a lot of ad revenue. We would have liked to have that, but we did fine. But it just shows there's a lot of different niches in the hobby and the Krause. What happened to the Krause culture as you were there when Chet was still the owner, or was there an
Sure. Oh, yeah.
Or then the F&W came in? How were you impacted by those transitions?
I think when I started in 93, there was something like, in a town of 1,300 people, there were 435 people worked at Krause. And certainly by the time of the sale at the turn of the century, it had already started going the other direction, and then it became more precipitous. So that was a huge part of the changes that we all had to deal with. A company that had been so dynamic in the community become each year less and less. But I can't go through this without mentioning that Chet Krause was a giant among men, and his impact on this community, you couldn't overstate it if you wanted to, and nobody would want to.
Great guy, yeah. I thought there was an ESOP, and then F&W came in and acquired the whole thing. Is that?
Chet installed the ESOP, I think, around 1988, and that's what was sold in 2001 as the employees essentially sold their shares, and everybody who had been there for some period did very well, and some of the people who had been there since the very beginning when they got the shares at the best rate did remarkably well. So he fixed the careers of a lot of people. He certainly helped mine.
How'd that change the culture? Because basically, surely at that point, you're staying there, but my recollection is some key people left when they were cashed out.
Some did, but I attribute some of that to simply having the ability to do the cash out was so phenomenal for some of them. But it did change. There was a time when I had worked through my life. I had worked at the Pentagon, and I had worked for New York State at its edifice in Albany. So I had worked for two of the biggest bureaucracies in the world. And I thought the time at Krause was just incredible. It was such a friendly, fun organization to work for. That started to change with once you sell out to private equities and all the pressures that come with revenue and all that. So that changed, but it was still a heck of a career for me to be able to work in a hobby that I loved.
But through it all, were you collecting? You're producing cards. You're selling your own cards over the years, but what was your collecting interest?
I kept by gently asking my mother to keep them, I kept my cards. In 1970, I was in the Navy over in the Philippines, and I ordered a set of 1970 tops from Larry Fritsch and asked my mother to just leave it in the box. And so I bought those cards from Fritsch over the 70s. And then in the late 80s, when things got smoking, I started trying to fill in sets that I'd never had. So I built a 54, 55, 56, 57, 58, and then into the 60s. And now, since retirement, I've sold pretty much everything except my favorites, which is 59 and 60. So I always said you can tell how old somebody is by if they're collectors, ask them what their favorite year is, and you can add 8 or 9 years, and that's the age.
I hear you. We're the similar age, I think. So,
yeah,
fond memories. But so, are you still going to nationals? What is your hobby involvement?
Other than I love my work with Blado and working on his auction catalogs, I haven't gone to a national or even much of a decent show in 10 or 11 years, but that's primarily because I have these 4 wonderful, great nieces and nephew. And every year we've gone to the Wilderness Park at Wisconsin Dells, and it matches the time of the national convention every year. So I go with the kiddies and flash around, and that's just fine.
They're running a big reschedule that one. Actually, it's in Atlantic City, so it's a little further than Chicago, but you might want to reschedule, see if they're having another of the huge Wisconsin Dells summer shows. Yeah. And schedule your trip with the great nieces and nephews for that weekend.
Yeah, Wisconsin Dells.
Rich, you may not be
one of the top shows in the country.
Yeah.
Yes, but my sister schedules, the grandmother schedules the time for the Wisconsin Dells trip.
Okay, you may want to talk to grandma then and tell her
hope or desire to contradict.
Instead, I want to go off for a day.
Grandma's the boss. Like Jim says, I'll go to a Wisconsin Dells show maybe someday.
Well, they're good. They're good. So that'll be great. Any questions you have of us? Because Rich and I have been slogging along in the hobby from our vantage points for all these years and had many pleasant interactions with you, but don't see as much.
Jim, do you remember we played golf about 10 years ago in Maui? It was a vacation at...
Oh, one of the things a kid had when he had a special outing?
It was one of his. So we had, I think I spent a week or 10 days and played the plantation course 3 times.
I love it.
And that was,
I love downhill holes.
Do you still get to Maui at all or Hawaii?
I haven't been in a couple of years, but who can go to Hawaii now? Because you can't, there's the traveling challenges, but I'm looking forward to getting back out there. And Kit's always been a good friend, and it's a great, I just need an excuse, like we're saying.
Even Kit didn't get there last year because of the pandemic.
Yeah.
He spent the year in the mainland.
Yeah, he doesn't have such a tough life on the mainland either. But TS, thanks for sharing your time with us. We'll do another episode again. And thanks, Rich. Great to catch up. And
yeah, anytime.